If you are just someone who believes in democracy and checks and balances, then this is a good thing. Then this election actually means that everyone wins out to a certain degree and that democracy wins, which is not something we can say that often these days.
What could go right? I'm Zachary Carabell, the founder of the Progress Network, joined as always by my co-host, Emma Varvaloucas, the executive director of, you got it, the Progress Network. And this week on our podcast, we're going to look at something that in many ways went much more spectacularly right than almost anyone anticipated. Right in terms of the process, right in terms of the entire arc, and I suppose for some people, given that we're about to talk about an election in one of the world's democracies, in fact, in the world's largest democracy, I'm sure some people didn't like the outcome of the election, in which case it didn't go right at all. It went spectacularly wrong. But from a democratic process perspective, it certainly went right. And from an outcome perspective, for those who were despairing about the future of democracy, it also went rather right. So we're going to talk about India. For many Americans, and a lot of our audience is American, this may seem a bit other, but the fact is India is the world's largest democracy. It says a lot about the nature of democracy in the world. And we are tethered to that, just like we are tethered to everything else. We are, whether we like it or not, global citizens. And the results in India are dramatically important because it is a sizable portion of the 8 billion people on the planet. It's nearly a fifth of the entire population of the world resides in India, and it's a democracy. So we're going to talk to somebody who has looked at these things deeply, continues to look at these things deeply, and who I believe will shed some light on what was both a surprising and in many ways unexpected outcome.
So today we're going to talk to Ravi Agrawal. He's the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, and he also hosts Foreign Policy Live, which is the magazine's video channel and podcast. Before that, he was at CNN, I believe, for more than a decade. And as Zachary mentioned, we're going to talk to him all about India, of which he's also written a book that's called India Connected, How the Smartphone is Transforming the World's Largest Democracy. Are you ready, Zachary?
I am ready. Let's talk to Ravi. Ravi Agrawal, it is a pleasure to have you on What Could Go Right. You know, when we scheduled this interview, we, and I think an astonishingly large percentage of everyone else who either cared about the Indian election was polling, expected an extraordinarily different outcome. And before we get into the weeds of that, I mean, this, I think, for those, we have a predominantly American audience, for those who are listening to this, it's unclear right now whether this also should tell us something about the contemporary state of polling, you know, whether there was an aspect of what went on in India that just kind of says, weirdly enough, in a world full of data and data mining and AI, and what appears to be the ability of us to marshal huge amounts of data in ever more sliced and diced and micro fashions, that our ability to get things completely wrong has not changed at all. So, I mean, maybe if we could start there, Ravi. I mean, again, we're going to presume that there's a generalized understanding that the BJP, which is the ruling party of Prime Minister Modi, while it did return to power in a coalition, vastly underperformed. I think it got 240 seats as opposed to whatever, you know, they had said, oh, we're going to get 400 seats and have a supermajority. Lost, 63 seats? I think that was, I mean, it was a big electoral setback, even though it is certainly true that Modi is still and will be now prime minister for the third term. So I guess maybe, Ravi, if we could start with, how did everybody, including Modi's party as well, get this so wrong?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there were three sets of expectations that were dashed. One is all of the opinion polling over the last year or so, all of which suggested that not only would Narendra Modi and his BJP come back to power, but that they would win an outright majority on their own, so more than 272 seats, and that they would easily exceed that as well. Modi and his deputies themselves then, closer to the election time, said that they expected to cross 400 seats, which has never been done before in Indian electoral history. And this would mean that they would get a supermajority. It would allow them to push through constitutional reform even. And then finally, on June the 1st, which was 3 days before the election results emerged, And India's elections go on for 6 weeks. They're just this incredibly long process in various phases in various parts of the country. On June 1st, poll after poll, these are exit polls conducted by different news channels and media companies. Almost all of them predicted that not only would the BJP win a majority on their own, but some of them went as far as saying that, yes, the exit polls show that they would get 400 seats. So everyone got it wrong. This could be a fundamental misreading of the national mood. This could be the fact that vote shares don't always translate into seats. And India is especially complicated here, partly because this is not a two-party system. This is a multi-party system. And then there's some evidence now that the opposition's vote share combined and coalesced in a way that it hadn't in the last 2 elections, which made it much harder for pollsters to try and wrap their heads around how this converts into seats. Now, there are some theories, and I won't endorse them, that this was part of a ploy, that there were some very powerful people who wanted to put out flawed opinion polls, flawed exit polls even, to make a killing on the stock market. I have seen no real proof that that is the case. Where I fall, I think, is that everyone just got it wrong because they'd gotten it wrong before as well in underestimating how powerful the BJP is and was, and Modi. And I think in fear of getting it wrong again and thinking that Modi tends to overperform, not underperform, if you look at his history, that's kind of where everyone was.
In US elections now, I think there's a policy not to report on exit polls, or at least to not report on them as if they're conclusive. So people will talk about them with some kind of, if they want some descriptive flavor before the results come in. But it is one of these things where, you would think, right, someone leaves the polling place and someone goes up to them and says, who did you vote for? You'd think that that would be a fairly binary, simple equation. And yet, for reasons that I'm not sure everyone understands, it's just not. So I get the exit poll factor. It's everything else that seemed was how badly he underperformed in the north and places like Uttar Pradesh and kind of areas that had been the Hindu, Gangetic Plain stronghold of the BJP, the Hindu nationalist, and that really, like, if you'd massively underperformed in the South, and for those who don't know, there's a real South-North divide in India, politically, culturally, linguistically, historically, but like that seemed surprising.
Yeah, it was surprising. And surprising in part because, if you go back to the start of the campaign, Modi inaugurated this big temple to the god Ram in January. And at the place where this was inaugurated, Ayodhya, his party lost the seat there. This was meant to be the thing that the people really wanted. This was meant to be the thing that would consolidate the Hindu vote. And yet it didn't. And there's several lessons you can draw from it. One is that Hindus are not this monolith. They're not all going to vote on one issue and one issue alone, which is religion. 2 is that, when a leader comes out publicly and says, I'm going to win all these seats, I'm going to dominate, it's not the most likable thing. And there is now some sense that they just completely overreached. In telling the people that we are coming back to power with this huge landslide majority, I think there's an element here of the people just wanting to check that power and to check that not just the power itself, but the perception and the self-perception of power. And in a sense, it doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum, checking power and checking in general too much power. And one should argue, in fact, that Narendra Modi weakened the media. He weakened the judiciary. He may have been seen as business friendly, but he was also seen as too cozy with billionaires. There were elements of his power that needed to be checked, needed to be balanced out. And India needed a stronger opposition. And obviously hindsight is 2020, but it could be that India's voters, as diverse as they are, made a set of choices that was a check on what they were hearing in the media about dominance. And there could be lessons there for other countries and parties around the world.
I mean, do people feel generally like, yes, like let's go forward, let's do the thing? Or are they worried? Or what's the general vibe?
I would say the general vibe is actually quite good. If you are a fan of Modi's, he is prime minister. If you want his agenda, which is a mix of welfare policies, subsidies for the poor, a focus on infrastructure and development, a very bullish projection of Indian power overseas. If you like all of that stuff, if you like his pro-Hindu agenda, most of which has been accomplished already, to be clear, then you're pleased in that he is still your prime minister. If you supported other parties, you now feel like you have a shot. You now feel like your parties have more of a say. You feel like parliament matters again. So parliamentary debate, which Modi shunned largely, is now going to be much more important. The media will feel a little bit more emboldened and, I hope, frankly, chastised and ashamed of the fact that most of the big news channels were quite subservient to Modi over the last decade or so. If you are just someone who believes in democracy and checks and balances, then this is a good thing. Then this election actually means that everyone wins out to a certain degree and that democracy wins, which is not something we can say that often these days.
You know, there had been a narrative emerging, and it's a global narrative, but it was also particular to India, that you had this form of kind of authoritarian, or as Fareed Zakaria talked about, illiberal democracy years and years and years ago, and is still talking about it. And you did a conversation with him recently as well, as did we. And that Modi was the prima inter pares of this narrative, that it was the most obvious example of a sort of populist leader with authoritarian nationalist tendencies who was using that animated spirit to get more votes and kind of crowd out the public sphere, using the levers of democracy, and then also some levers that were much more questionable. I mean, it's true the press had become quite subservient. But what does it do about that narrative? I mean, was that narrative, because the international community bought into it as well. I think we all bought into it, right? That this was working. It was successful. It was popular. Does that mean that we should have been telling a different story, or was it working for a while and then suddenly it didn't?
So I don't think we got it wrong in that sense. I think the diagnosis that authoritarianism is on the rise globally is a correct diagnosis and a correct trend line. I think illiberal democracy is on the rise globally. That is also a trend line that, holds true, even with this election, by the way. But I think what India's election tells us is that trends work until they don't. When people get to vote, they vote based on a certain set of parameters. And frankly, to some degree, one of them was these trends. I think they wanted a more democratic India. I think they looked around them. They saw the dominance of one party, the absolute dominance of one man. I mean, if you get a COVID vaccine in India, or if you get free grain, Modi's face would have been stamped on it. This was, absolute cult of personality. And again, don't get me wrong, he still has many, many fans in India. He is easily, by far and away, the most popular politician in India, even after these elections. I think what we saw was just a check on untrammeled power. And in a sense, India may offer some lessons for the world in that despite the deck being stacked against the opposition in terms of funding, in terms of media access, in terms of incumbency, when you have an election that is largely free and fair, anything can happen. And people aren't stupid. I think people are able to distinguish between narrative and reality. They also understand trend lines, and they sometimes correct, they sometimes overcorrect, and then go back. And so in India's case, the mean from the 1980s until 2014, when Modi came to power, was this sense that coalition governments are the way forward, to have a pluralistic democracy work. Then there came this yearning for a strongman leader, someone who can, quote unquote, get things done. And I think the mood in India seems to have shifted a bit in that they've tried that. And now they're trying something a little different, a mix between the 80s and 90s mean and the 2014 to 2024 mean of Modi and dominance. And they're trying Modi with checks and balances. So you've got to respect that. And I imagine globally, just as dictators learn from each other and autocrats learn from each other, I think voters learn from each other and will be looking to India with some sense of hope and optimism wherever they are in the world.
Do you essentially agree with the piece that Foreign Policy ran recently that India has reached peak Modi? Like, despite the fact, as you were just talking about, his face was everywhere, people give him a lot of credit for India's booming economy, whether or not that's valid to give him that credit. Do you think that from here it's going to be like a slow slide down, or is it possible that we could go back in the other direction again?
I edited that essay. This is an essay by Devesh Kapoor, who teaches at Johns Hopkins. He is widely seen as one of the leading authorities on Indian politics in the United States. He's trained many South Asia scholars in this country, so he has a lot of fans. And his piece was titled Modi's Peaked, and the BJP has peaked. And, he basically looks around the world at various other kind of dominant parties, whether it's the PRI in Mexico, or the ANC in South Africa, makes the point that when you have dominance for a long time, a range of problems begin to set in. And, you're not as efficient as you could be. Cult of personality is the kind of thing that just erodes a party's power over time. I think he's broadly right. We, by the way, discussed this essay weeks before we published it. So I'm not saying Devesh was prescient about the results. The results surprised him and me both, but we thought it would be provocative to posit that the BJP had peaked. And then the election results came out and we rushed the piece out because it was no longer a provocation, it was an explanation of what had happened. And I think Devesh is right. Look, if you claim to be fixing a problem, at some point you either have to fix it or you have to move on. So when you're in power for long enough and you've railed against previous governments, at some point you're carrying the can. You have to fix it or you have to be judged. And I think that's part of the cycle of parties around the world. And as long as you're a democracy, then, the judgment is one that actually works. And then you get booted out or you get corrected, as we've seen in India.
What makes India fascinating is you had this moment at the beginning of the 21st century where there was a lot of sense that there were a bunch of countries that had whatever troubled, challenging, interesting history they had in the 20th century that were poised for some sort of breakout politically and or economically. And India and China, as well as Brazil and some others, were kind of part of that mix. And then you had a 20-year period where China very evidently, at least economically, surpassed even the wildest expectations of what was possible. And India, in many ways, underperformed even modest expectations about what was likely. And now you have this moment in the 2020s where, when I was in India last year, it felt very much like what people were saying and thinking about China in 2002, 3, and 4. There was this sense, kind of a palpable sense of possibility, of confidence, of this is our moment. And some of that was in spite of Modi, not because of him. Some of that clearly was, a feeling amongst more professional classes that whatever Modi's faults in terms of Hindu nationalism, that there was kind of an economic stability / opening that was new. Is there still a sense of, if the kind of the global story was largely shaped by the emergence of China, let's say for the 20 years after 2001? And what I mean by that is that was a potent X factor that has shaped a lot of the world. Could you say the same still being true, or is it, do you think, going to be true of India for the next 15, 20 years?
So yes and no. I think China is just an outlier. I think China's growth miracle, double-digit growth for 4 decades, is as big a deal in the global span of history as the Industrial Revolution was. It's just something that was a very specific set of circumstances for an incredibly large number of people over a prolonged period of time that seemed to sort of defy market forces. So it sort of had a lot to do with China's style of government and very sort of single-minded focus on development and growth. I don't think that can be replicated anywhere else in the world, maybe even ever. having said that, I think the Indian growth story is remarkable. I think what India has achieved in the last 20 odd years, 30 years, if you look at 1991 was the year that India's Congress coalition government, by the way, put in place a set of reforms in a moment of crisis. They opened up to the world, which allowed India's growth to really take off from the 90s onwards. If you look at all the trend lines, they point to the 90s as the period where people first began to see India as this economy that had immense potential. Modi's done some good things and actually has stood in the way of some other things. I think there's little doubt that he has worked hard to make India a friendlier place for business for both domestic and international investors. He has really pushed hard to improve infrastructure, so building thousands and thousands of miles of highways and roads every year, doubling the number of airports in a decade, building more rail lines, little things like gas connections, electricity connections are up by 45% in the last decade. So a lot of infrastructural pushes that are commendable, to say the least, and have won him support. By the way, women, for example, have voted for him in droves in 2014 and 2019 at the very least, in part because of his focus on the construction of toilets or electricity or gas connections. I think where he's fallen, and we've seen some of this in the way in which people have, to some degree, moved on from him in the 2024 election, is job creation. He has really struggled to create good jobs for people. Unemployment is in the 7-8% range, just too high. Youth unemployment for a country as young as India is around about 15% by some estimates. That's just way too high, and means India could well face a demographic disaster in the coming years. So those are all things that I think another Modi government and other governments after that will have to address. There's one very interesting data point, however. FDI, foreign direct investment in India, is actually down in the last 3 years. And there are a range of potential reasons for this, but one reason is that some investors are spooked by the fact that if you want to get something done in India, you've kind of got to be within this sort of special cabal of Modi friends. So, for example, there's India's second biggest billionaire, this guy called Gautam Adani. All of the stocks linked to him that bear his name, so various Adani stocks, they're known on the market as Modi stocks. And the day that the election results began to emerge, those stocks tanked by double-digit percentages, every single one of them, because there was this broad acceptance that if Modi wants to build, I don't know, a factory for semiconductors, he's going to call one of his friends and say, build it, and then they will build it. And so if you were a foreign investor or even a domestic investor, to get something done, you needed to be in that circle. It could be that in a coalition government with more checks and balances, market forces may actually be strengthened, not weakened, which actually bodes well for India. If you look at historically, coalition governments have actually been better for Indian growth and development than the opposite.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned this point about FDI, foreign direct investment, because the contrast there with China is so extreme. We had literally trillions of dollars of foreign direct investment in China from 2001 till the late to mid 2010s. In many ways, a lot of China's industrial base or contemporary manufacturing base was paid for by outside China. And you have almost none of that in India. I mean, there is definitely foreign direct investment in India, but it is just it's fractional. I think it's 1/20th or less than 1/20th. That may not be an accurate number, but it actually may be worse than that. And that's a huge differential in the way things work.
Yeah, exactly. And, as I think the American companies especially, I don't like the word decoupling, but as they look to friendshore or nearshore or turn to other markets, Apple, for example, is trying to build more of a manufacturing base in India, perhaps because it was over-reliant on China. as companies and countries look to do that, India will be a destination, regardless of the government in power. Will be a country that they turn to, and of course it's competitive, right? They will also turn to other Southeast Asian markets, maybe even Latin American markets. But if you look at the mix of political stability, availability of skilled labor, and the potential for land acquisition, which, by the way, has always been a problem in India, land acquisition and labor laws. If the Modi government can look to focus on those, they'll remain a very attractive place for companies to come and do business.
So this vision for India, in the next 25 years, I think there's the goal to become a high income nation, right? And there's also the goal of becoming a leader for the global South, becoming a leader generally in the world. You just described both some of the factors that would lead India toward that direction and some of the missing ingredients. I mean, taking that all together, would you place your bet on India making it to this vision that's been described, or do you think might be a little bit rocky?
It will muddle its way there. I think one distinction to make here, and again, perhaps the Indian voters voted based on this, is there's a lot of noise about India being the fifth largest economy in the world, and within a decade or so will become the third largest economy in the world, behind only the United States and China. And I think what that narrative of a big rising collective ignores is that average incomes in India are still extremely low. So the average Indian makes the equivalent of $2,500 a year. That is about a fifth what the average Mexican makes. Similar, about a fifth of what the average Chinese makes. And in terms of what the average American makes, gosh, you're looking at 1/20th or something like that, 1/25th. India is a poor country, and it takes a long time for average incomes to actually rise. And so while India may have all these billionaires, and if you travel to one of the big cities, there are a lot of things that look impressive. Again, I mean, India has a lot of median growth that would need to take place for India to become a middle income country. That's 5x to reach Mexico's levels of median prosperity. So I think the path to that is not an easy one. I think India would have to liberalize further. There are a lot of reforms it would have to put in place. And there are a lot of structural hurdles that begin with the fact that it has simply been unable to create manufacturing jobs, let alone moving up the skilled ladder. So it will not be an easy path. It's not a foregone conclusion at all.
Broadening the aperture a bit, and you referenced Mexico a moment ago in terms of comparative rates of affluence and or poverty, depending on whether you want to look at it as a cup half full or cup half empty. There has been, we talked a little at the beginning about the trend toward, let's say, authoritarian democracy or illiberal, and yet you do have over the past several months multiple countries, multi-ethnic, complicated, challenging, go to the polls, have an electoral result that was widely accepted within those countries, and there's always accusations of fraud here and there and corruption, and produce governments in many ways that were governments of change. So you had Mexico, South Africa, Indonesia, India, obviously Brazil last year. Does that offset or counter the narrative of democracy in retreat, rise of, it strikes me that if you had said to somebody in 1960 or 1970 that at this point in the 20th century, you'd have a series of quote unquote non-Western countries go to the polls and produce unequivocally democratic results that would be widely accepted and would then kind of go about their business, that would have been seen as an unbelievably optimistic scenario given the world. And I mean, in many ways, I don't know if we take it for granted today, but I do think it's something, worth stepping back and recognizing that it's been an awfully positive few months for just the concept of democracy, hasn't it?
It really has. And especially with India, I think more than any of the other elections you mentioned, India strikes me as the one that is the most positive in that there was a trend line of less democracy, and democracy corrected the trend line. That to me is the most powerful example of how democracy can be self-correcting despite all kinds of things that are arrayed against it, from authoritarian leaders to pillars of democracy being systematically weakened, whether it's the media or the judiciary. It's interesting that you mentioned Mexico and South Africa. I feel like they're at different stages of the India curve. So South Africa, for example, with the ruling African National Congress, ANC, they kind of remind me of India's Congress Party in that they were at the forefront of a freedom struggle of some form. And then over time, a mix of corruption, inefficiency led to decay, and then eventually led to coalition governments, and then led to the emergence of an alternative. So if you look at what happened with India's Congress in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, in a sense, the ANC in South Africa is pretty much on that same trajectory, where it is going from absolute power and popularity to now struggling to figure out how to form a coalition government. And then you may see the rise of stronger alternatives in the future. Mexico is a very complicated one, where PRI could be, the Congress in the Indian reference point. That then declined, and then you had essentially a much more democratic Mexico in the early 2000s. And now you have this party, Morena, which is led by, or was led by, founded by AMLO, Andres Manuel López Obrador, who, like Modi, is a leader who is immensely popular, very populist, raised the minimum wage, for example, has been very good for workers, but not business friendly, but also increasingly authoritarian, a real cult of personality, has essentially allowed for the military to control all kinds of institutions, whether it's policing, whether it is control of the airports, ports. The military is really just back in Mexico in a big way. And in many senses, while on the one hand, we've been wanting to celebrate the victory of Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexico's first female president, breaking a glass ceiling, she is AMLO's protege. And the signs are that democracy is still weakened in Mexico, that yes, the people have voted for her in essentially a landslide victory, where the polls were proven to be correct for once. But there are many people who rightly will worry about democracy in Mexico, where you have, a person in power, a party in power that is all powerful, that is reducing the role of the state and increasing the role of the military to achieve their ends. So it's a mixed picture globally. And I think we are right to worry about the trend lines of the rise of illiberal democracy, the rise of nationalism, jingoism, all of these forces that make it harder for true democracy to flourish. And then you have an example like India's, where it self-corrects despite the system, not because of it.
I get that none of these are perfect, and there's a whole series of shades of gray, and we can kind of cherry pick around the world whether you want to see examples of whatever democratic backsliding versus democratic efflorescence. People can point to Poland as an example of it didn't, it looked like it was going down the path to kind of Hungarian semi-authoritarianism, and then Donald Tusk and his party won, and they're kind of doing their best to reverse that. You thought Bolsonaro was going to be on the verge of a kind of darker version of 1970s Brazilian politics. That didn't happen. Doesn't mean it won't, but Lula won. I don't even know what to make of Javier Milei in Argentina. I mean, that's its own kind of interesting sui generis. It's not like Argentina's politics have been anything resembling functional for an extraordinarily long time, if ever. But it does strike me that this is the challenge of, like, we all live in the present, right? And there's a human desire to have very conclusive narratives about what's going on that will then extend presumably into the future, so that we can, grapple with the unknown by stamping it with false certainty. And the present's always going to be messy, certainly compared to the past, because we don't know how the future is going to turn out. So there are all these threads and there are all these possibilities, and we don't know which one, and we're always trying to guess and ascertain. I'm just struck by, if you had felt and done the temperature of how I think people have been feeling the past few years, these outcomes in my mind don't follow that narrative neatly. Now, that doesn't mean they won't, and it doesn't mean that all these things aren't true, and that, Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico will prove to be some sort of weird, maybe she'll be the Medvedev to Vladimir Putin, and AMLO will be pulling the strings. That's an obscure reference, but it'll do as an analogy. So I don't know. I am more heartened by the fact of what's gone on in the past year, and the demonstration of people, at least, collectively deciding their future with all the messiness that it entails, as opposed to, oh, well, the great experiment of the 20th century in some version of democracy and open markets and open societies has proven to be an abject, if not failure, then it's been rejected or seized or overthrown or whatever. And like, that's my provisionally optimistic view in the moment.
I kind of agree with you on this, in that I think things could have been much worse on all of the elections that we're discussing, and including the ones that we haven't discussed. I think when you think of the challenges that people have faced, and one of the big ones is the media. So I think in the last few years, alongside countries that have seen a cult of personality, there has been an element of media capture where, you mentioned Putin, he controls TV in Russia. Modi largely, I won't say controls the media in India, but he is connected to the people who really have control over India's mass media. Most countries around the world that have leaders who have an authoritarian bent, they are accompanied with situations where media as a pillar of democracy has been weakened. And I think the heartening thing here is that despite that, regular people have found ways of cutting through and using YouTube and being influencers who tackle this kind of media capture with humor and with jokes and with memes and with very powerful narratives of, speaking truth to power. That's what we saw in India, by the way. There were all of these YouTubers with tens of millions of followers who were able to basically call BS when they needed to, and were immensely popular and led to a sense of a bubble being pricked, which may have then in part led to people voting the way they did. And there's a feedback loop from country to country, from election to election. And I think we are going to see more and more influencers. So not people who are paid to sit behind an anchor desk, but just people, regular people, who rise up, who are able to speak truth to power, and who are able to do so with humor, by using memes, by connecting with people where they are in an authentic way, that I think will end up shaping political movements, elections, choices in ways that I think most people haven't cottoned on to. And I include myself in that as an old school media guy who is just beginning to grapple with how fragmented and fractured the media is. And I used to lament that, but I'm coming around to the notion that there are real upsides to that.
Well, what you're saying was certainly the case in the European Parliament elections in Cyprus, recently with Phidias Panayiotou, because he's a 24-year-old YouTuber, 2 million followers, went on TV with 3 neckties and was like, hey, I'm running for parliament, guys. And 40% of Gen Z voters voted for him. And he did get voted in as an independent, which I've heard people interpreting, again, like we were saying with Modi, as like a screw you to the current government of Cyprus. But it's also just like, wow, really, like anybody can become a politician if they have, influence and reach.
Yeah, exactly. If you look around the world historically, politicians were more likely to be like landed gentry. I mean, there's a term in Pakistan, the term is electable, someone who basically has land and has people who work on the land and, is of course going to get elected. And I think what you're describing, this example, is something we'll see more and more of around the world. And it's a churning of traditional systems of achieving power. It breaks through funding models, which are campaign finance is broken the world over. We can agree on that. In as much as young media influencers have a way of getting around all these systems, the party system, the funding system, That's a good thing. I think it's a new form and phase of democracy that will shake things up in a way that also, frankly, energizes young people who often don't feel energized when they have to vote for people who are 4 times their age.
Well, I was quite optimistic, Ravi. That wasn't at all depressing dinner guest takes.
I tried.
We appreciate you. We appreciate the effort.
Ravi, I want to thank you for your thoughts today. I mean, as we mentioned in your intro, India is the largest, most complicated democracy on the planet, full stop, with a population bigger than the next few democracies, including the United States and Brazil combined, and the entire EU for that matter. So paying attention to it really does matter. It matters to all of us. It is the ultimate laboratory of democracy. I think, again, the fact that it had this result, it surprised us. We didn't even get into the polling questions. I think for Americans, certainly, I think we're aware viscerally that even our own polling system is largely broken. Cell phones, how do you reach people? Who picks up the phone? Who talks? It's one of the more bewildering aspects of our contemporary world that it's actually hard to figure out what people think and what they're planning on doing, which I kind of like, by the way, in a world where we think everything is predictable, right?
Yeah, I celebrate that. I mean, it's nice to have surprises. It's nice also that people have a mind of their own. Like we tend to think sometimes, partly because of polls, that we've got it, we understand them, and I like that people, throw up surprises. That's exactly what democracy was meant to be.
And I would say to all of you who don't, go read Foreign Policy. It's certainly, provides coverage of the world that you cannot find almost anywhere else. I mean, maybe in The Economist sometimes, but an awareness and a rigorous look every day as to what's going on in places that are vital and important, but at least for Western audiences often get ignored. I mean, everybody ignores everything except what's provincial. That's another human tendency. But go read Foreign Policy. Ravi's done an amazing job, and I urge all of you to pay attention. And thank you for your time today.
You are very kind to say that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ravi. So I like the point that you made at the end there, Zachary, about kind of cherry picking things that are going well as far as democracy and things that are not going well. My sort of favorite pet example at the moment was Senegal's big democratic turnaround. And then another one that I found out about recently is Mauritania. I mean, when's the last time anyone talked about Mauritania? They had their first peaceful transition of power in 2019, and they're about to probably, hopefully, head into their second. So obviously it's not like Senegal and Mauritania are world players the way that Mexico and India and China and Russia are, and so on and so forth. But still, there are kernels of hope in places that people just don't really care about looking at.
Right. And I think, again, let's take it as a given that most people are paying attention to the nascent and not so nascent problems in the world. And so some of this commentary is in relation to that. Like if everybody were just, oh, Hosanna, Hosanna, everything's great, look at how flourishing democracy is, I might be the first person to say, hey, wait a minute, there's some problems here and let's look at them. It's a kind of trying to create a more balanced view of what's going on, particularly in a time where, as we know, and the whole conceit of this podcast and what we're doing is there isn't a balanced view of what's going on, and it skews largely negative, not positive. And I think Ravi described it quite well at the end. Like, yes, it's great that a first woman was elected in Mexico, and she's certainly different from her predecessor, but there were a lot of problems in that election, and we don't know whether or not this is just going to go badly. We just know what happened on the day of the election. And that's kind of true everywhere. And look, the elephant in the room for American viewers is trying to figure out what the hell is going to happen and whether or not that democratic result will be accepted, whether it'll be accepted by Democrats if Trump wins, and I think more crucially, whether it'll be accepted by Trump if Biden wins or whoever's running for president at that time. And what that will say about the health of American democracy. It's almost certainly the case that whoever wins in the United States on November 5th will win because they won within that system. I mean, we have a screwy system because of the Electoral College, and kind of means you can win without winning the majority of the actual vote. That's a structural problem, but that doesn't make it illegitimate. I mean, I guess it could make it illegitimate if people start feeling like that's illegitimate, but that's a whole separate issue. And, there we are in a messy world that to me feels still much more functional than people think. Full stop. And I think the India result obviously demonstrated that unbelievably.
Yeah. And also more surprising, right? Ties back to the US discussion as well, where the polls in India were wrong. The polls in the US right now are very Biden's going to lose by a large margin. I'm not saying that they're wrong, but they've certainly been wrong in the past. And India is an especially interesting example because I've read analyses that were like, well, the polling was wrong because they haven't done a population census in India in a while, so they weren't weighting things correctly. And I've also read, like Fareed Zakaria wrote, for instance, that there is some evidence that Indians were just flat out lying about who they voted for. So there's just so many factors that we can consider a lot better after the fact than before the fact. And we'll see what happens in November.
We will definitely see what happens. And it will not be for lots of commentary from lots of people who claim that they know what's going to happen. Thank you all for listening to this week. As you know or may not know, we're also doing shorter news episodes weekly. So please tune into those as well. And send us your thoughts. Sign up for our newsletter, What Could Go Right, at theprogressnetwork.org. It's free. It's weekly. It gives you some news to think about that you might not otherwise have noticed. And please do enter into a conversation with us. Tell us what you think. Tell us what you'd like us to look at. Tell us what you think we're not looking at the way we should be. We will listen. We will take note. Whether or not we agree, we very much appreciate the time.